Good evening. Startled you. Welcome to First Congregational Church of Boulder, United Church of Christ. My name is Chris Broadway-Bauman, and I am enormously blessed to serve as the senior minister of this wonderful congregation. On behalf of this congregation, I want to say that we are honored by your presence here this evening with us for the annual MacKenzie Lecture. Tonight is a very special evening for us as a church, a poignant time, not only because we are delighted by the presence of Diana Butler Bass, we're all big fans, but also this year's MacKenzie Lecture falls on the weekend, which is a celebration of the life and ministry of the Reverend Bruce MacKenzie. On Sunday afternoon at 1:30, we will gather here again in this sanctuary for a worship service in Bruce's memory to commend him to God's eternal care. The Reverend Bruce MacKenzie was the senior minister of First Congregational Church from 1970 to 1997, 27 years. And then he was our minister emeritus and an active member of this congregation until his death on January 3rd this year. The MacKenzie Lectureship was created as a gift upon Bruce's retirement as senior minister in his honor and his wife Jeanette's honor, and in thanksgiving for their extraordinary service to the Boulder community. We rejoice that this evening Bruce and Jeanette's children are here, as well as other members of their extended family, to share in this event. We know that Bruce would have loved to be here with all of us, and surely his spirit is in this place. Following the lecture this evening, we hope that you'll linger for a time of refreshments and fellowship downstairs in our Plymouth Hall. You can get there by going back out the sanctuary, turning right and going down the stairs. If you go out and turn left and go down the hallway a little, you'll find an elevator which will also take you to the lower level. Diana will be there waiting for you after the lecture, and you'll have a chance to greet her more personally, to buy her books, and also to get them signed by her. As you exit the sanctuary this evening, there will be offering baskets there. This evening's lecture is a gift to you from the MacKenzie Lectureship, but your donation ensures that it can continue as an enduring legacy into the future. Tomorrow, we'll have more time with Diana as she leads a workshop with us from 9 a.m. until 1 p.m. There is still room for you to join us. You can either sign up this evening or you can show up tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. There is a fee for the workshop tomorrow. It's $25, and you can either pay for that tonight or bring your money with you tomorrow. On Sunday morning, Diana will be leading a 45-minute forum starting at 9:30, again downstairs in Plymouth Hall. That's Sunday morning. And she will be preaching at our 10:30 worship service. A gloriously full and inspiring weekend for all of us. I now invite Charlie Rassel from the MacKenzie Lectureship Committee to introduce Diana.
I'm pleased to introduce our speaker tonight for the MacKenzie Lectureship, which has had a long list of distinguished scholars, writers, and theologians come and speak at this lectureship. And Diana continues that grand tradition. She is an author, a speaker, an independent scholar specializing in American religion and culture. She holds a PhD in religious studies from Duke University and is the author of 9 books, including her latest, Grounded, Finding God in the World, A Spiritual Revolution, which currently has won 5 different awards, some literary, some spiritual. Diana regularly speaks at conferences, consults with religious organizations, leads educational events for religious leaders, and teaches and preaches in a variety of venues. She writes at the Huffington Post and the Washington Post and comments on religion, politics, and culture in the media, including USA Today, Time, Newsweek, CBS, CNN, Fox, PBS, and NPR. She is a recipient of numerous grants and awards, including the Franklin S. and Elizabeth D. Brewer Prize of the American Society of Church History, and an honorary Doctor of Divinity degree from the General Theological Seminary in New York. She also serves on the Board of Public Religion Research and is an advisor on the project for a National Museum of American Religion in Washington, D.C. So it is my honor to present our speaker tonight, Dr. Diana Butler Bass.
Well, have a good time. Thank you. Good evening. Okay, thank you so much, Chris. Oh, thank you so much for getting me out of the nation's capital. The week before said inauguration, I was in Louisiana, which was an interesting event. Really nice people. They were quite hospitable and very southern in that way that our neighbors to the south are. But I did get in an interesting conversation with a Republican judge at the Rotary Club who said to me, "Oh, you live in Washington, D.C.?" And I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "My wife's going to Washington, D.C. This next weekend." And I said, "Yes?" He said, "She's going to the inauguration. It's going to be a really big deal. Are you going?" And I said, "Well, I went to the last one." And then he said, "Well, do you have any plans for this weekend?" I said, "Well, I'm planning on being on the mall." "But I'm going to be there on Saturday." And he said, "Well, what's on Saturday?" I said, "Well, it's a big march. Women are gathering from all over the United States, and we're going to just make our presence known so that no one forgets that we're here and we have some things that we care about." And he said, "Oh," and I said, "Yes, I'm going to march, and I'm going to have on my pink hat." And at this point, there was a very progressive artist who was standing listening to this conversation. And she goes, "You're going to the march, and you're wearing a pink hat?" And she high-fives me. And the Republican judge says, "What's the pink hat?" And I said, "Are you sure you want to know?" And so there I was in Louisiana at the Rotary Club, next to a Catholic priest, a progressive artist who was the head of the museum, and a Republican judge explaining pussy hats. My husband said, "I think that you might have sort of a different conversation in Boulder." So if nothing else, current events are giving us adventures of connecting with each other in new ways, and I hope that we all can keep our sense of humor as we move through the months and the years to come. People know me as a voice in progressive Christianity. I don't really quite know what that means. I'm just myself. And it means, for me, what it means is that I'm deeply passionate about the world and about God, about our spiritual lives and about understanding the world around us and understanding theology and understanding the Bible more deeply in ways that cause our imaginations to fly open and help us to think and dream of all of the possibilities that lie before us and that lie before our future. The book, Grounded, that I'm going to be talking about this weekend, is a sort of play on words. Those of you who might be familiar with the liberal Protestant theological tradition will surely hear the echoes of Paul Tillich, who talked in the 1960s about God being the ground of our being. And so that play off of Tillich is present throughout the book. But it's also about what grounds us as a people, as cultures that share citizenship in this particular space and time, in this land, and people who are citizens of the globe, what grounds us together in the world, and what grounds our spiritual lives. And so I'm going to be talking about theology, I'm going to talk about the world, and I'm going to be talking about spirituality. The quote that I want to keep sort of front and center for those of you who will be here for the whole thing is this quote. I found this quote, gosh, it was so long ago now, I had to refresh my memory about where it came from. I read it first in graduate school in 1987 when I was at Duke. And it was in a book that had been written by a Baptist who was also a professor at Brown University in the American History Department. And it's a little book that's been quite influential on my thinking called Revivals, Awakenings, and Reform. And the author of the book was a fellow by the name of William McLaughlin, a renowned, really, church historian of the last century. This little book about American awakenings, which is a concept that you'll hear me talk about as we go through the next couple days. He quoted this author in his book, a fellow who in 1974 wrote an article about cultural change and the relationship between cultural change and religion. And this quote popped out then to me when I first read it in 1987, and I've never been able to forget it in the 30 years since. A change in the conception of God is a cultural event of some magnitude, especially because the character of a culture is heavily influenced by the notion of God that predominates within it. Over the last several years, I have become increasingly convinced that a huge part of the argument that we are having here in the United States about the future and about the past, about our policies, about how we want to live together, is actually an argument about God. And underneath this argument, and underneath the divisions and the conflicts that we feel, are different understandings of who we think God or not God to be. And so that's the territory that I want to explore. God, the ground of all being, who grounds us in the world and in our lives, and how our understandings of God are changing. In order to do that tonight, I want to take you to a beautiful place. I was born on the East Coast, lived there till I was 13, and then moved out to Arizona when I was in 8th grade. And I have lived on sort of both sides and in the middle, Memphis, Tennessee. That was a very interesting 3 years of my life. But I love the East Coast, and I think that sometimes out here in the West, we can forget how amazingly beautiful some parts of the East are. My daughter is a first-year student at the University of Virginia this year. It's so exciting. I'm an empty nester, which is a whole different way of being in the world. And Charlottesville, Virginia, if you've never been there, is one of the true beautiful geographical gems of the United States, as well as the University of Virginia being a World Heritage Site for its incredible architecture and its connection to the American story through Thomas Jefferson. So anyway, my daughter is this first-year student, and I don't know how much you can remember back to then, and I'm sure there are some college professors here who can certainly see this reflected in the lives of your own students now. That's a hard time. Now, I remember when I was a college professor, we used to say among ourselves that the first 6 weeks of college were among the biggest periods of transformation in anyone's life. And so there was my daughter down there in Charlottesville going through all of this that I understood as a professor and I was feeling as a mother. And one morning she sends me a text. It was very early, and it was this picture. And I said, and it said next to it, Mom, I was feeling like I didn't know which way to turn, and I needed to feel grounded. So I went hiking this morning at dawn, and she went up into the Shenandoah National Forest hiking and met the sunrise at this beautiful place where the sun at this time of the year in fall comes right over this little gap in the Blue Ridge. And she wrote a second text underneath the picture, and she said, I feel better now. The sun always rises. Now, I carried this picture around with me for some weeks, and I had it as my screen on my phone. And I thought, what a great thing for my 19-year-old daughter to share with me what grounds her. And that this was a very holy moment for her, and a place where she sort of reconnected with herself and with her purpose for being a student. And I thought about the picture not only because of its beauty and the gift that she had given me and how grateful I was for that gift, but also thought about my own life. And that when I was a first-year student in college and I wanted to feel grounded, I would go to a place that looked like this. Not quite like this, because this one was built in 1767, and I went to college in California. And I did not go to the Santa Barbara Mission, but I went to a little Episcopal church that was about 100 years old when I wanted to feel grounded. But this is another Virginia landmark, and it's a church building. And I thought, well, wow. My daughter walks up into the mountains, and I went to church. And isn't that a parable for change over a couple generations in American life? And it's not that baby boomers don't like mountains, or that we didn't go up to mountains, or people who are silent generation or greatest generation people didn't think about going into the mountains or to the beach or wherever it was to connect with God. But we were trained. Our parents told us that if we really truly wanted to be grounded, if we wanted to meet God, that we could be certain that God was in a place that looked like this. Well, Emma also sent me this. This is a chart of the religious breakdown of the students who are in the honors dorm at UVA. And you can see from this chart, it does not probably look like the chart that they would have had of your dorm when you might have been in college, unless you have been in college fairly recently. Almost 35% of the people who are in the honors dorm with my daughter consider themselves atheists or agnostics. That's the red area there. 13% or so say they are nothing in particular. The blue area, 25.5%, are people who identify as Christian and Protestant. This 10.7% are Catholics. And then you see here some level of religious diversity, Greek and Russian Orthodox, 6.7% Jewish. Notice this is not representative of the American population. This is mostly representative of Fairfax County, Virginia, who all the students from my county tend to go to UVA. But you have Buddhists here and then Hindus. Now, Emma sent me this, and she said next to this picture, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea." And what you had no idea about? And she said, "I thought everybody was Christian." I said, "Well, just because your parents are and you grew up in church, you're not paying a lot of attention." And she said, "This is really surprising to me." And I asked her the question. I said, "Well, which box did you check?" Because I wasn't really actually sure. And she said, "Well, I checked Christian, Protestant, because that's what I am." And she said, "I can't believe that all these people are atheists and agnostics and nothing at all." And she knew a bit about religious diversity. She said, "I'm really surprised." And so I texted her this. This is, of course, what happens if your mother studies religion. So I said to her, well, honey, what I saw in your chart is only slightly different than the national statistics. And so it took a little while, about 15 minutes, but she texted back to me eventually. She said, I guess I shouldn't have been surprised. Because this is the picture of all of us right now, nationally, what we look like in terms of when a survey taker comes along and says, what are you religiously? This is how we respond. This particular chart is broken out into generational pools. The furthest line over that direction is all Americans who are between the ages of 18 and 29. The second line is roughly what we call Gen X, and that would be 30 to 49-year-olds. The next line is roughly baby boomers. This is from 2 years ago, by the way. 50 to 64-year-olds, and then 65 plus are silent generation and greatest generation American adults. And very quickly, this chart shows us something, simply by the colors. The blue areas of the chart are the percentage of people in each one of these different generational pods that are white, Anglo-European background people who are Christians. Either evangelical Christians, that's the darkest blue, or mainline Christians, the medium blue, and then Catholics are that light blue, and then that little teeny sliver of blue right there are Mormons. The yellows and reds, the colors that are above that, those are people of color, non-white people who are Christians. So that group includes Black Protestants and Hispanic Catholics and Hispanic Protestants, and people who are other Christian, like, say, gone-in Presbyterians, people who come from Africa who might be Protestants or Asian Catholics, so there's a lot of diversity there. And then you see there's some purple colors, and those colors are world religions. So everything from Jews to Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, and Sikhs. And then you get into this green color up here. Those are the people who are religiously unaffiliated. And then finally that gray at the very top are people who refused or don't know how to answer the question. So when I sent this back to Emma, you see what is true. And this chart and charts like it have been much under discussion in this past year's election cycle. A friend of mine, as a matter of fact, the person who is the president of the organization who collected these statistics, a fellow by the name of Robert Jones, wrote a book this year called The End of White Christian America. And that book was about these statistics. How the percentage of population that are Anglo-European background people who are Christians is in decline, and that these other areas, religious diversity in the purple areas, that is growing. The multicolor oranges and yellows, that is people of color who are Christians, that is growing. And then, of course, the big story that the media loves to talk about is the growth of the people who say that they are none of the above. Now, I have shown this chart in various forms in the last 5 years because I didn't have this chart, but I had an earlier version of it that I was showing before this chart existed. And it's really been fascinating to me to be on the road with statistics like this. It surprised my daughter, but it actually kind of comforted her when she saw that what was happening among her immediate friends, the people she now sort of shares dorm with and hangs out with all the time, is really an echo of what is happening on a much larger scale across the United States. And so she goes, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised. No, you shouldn't have been surprised. And I've been in places where I show this chart where people have started crying People walked out of rooms. They didn't want to believe it. One time I showed the chart, and a lovely woman who was well into her 80s got up during the Q&A session and said, "This chart gives me so much hope." And I said to her, "Oh gosh, it gives me a lot of hope too. What hope does it give you?" And she said, "When all those young kids grow up, they're all going to come back to church." I felt like the worst human being ever, having to inform her that this was not a longitudinal study, that this was a snapshot of what America is like today. And indeed, the little bit that we do have in longitudinal studies now, going back 25 to 30 years, actually shows that Americans in every one of these generational groups are less religiously identified than they were 30 years ago. So the longitudinal studies is actually, they back up with a snapshot picture. Now, a lot of people, when they talk about this on the road, and I've certainly heard any number of my colleagues and fellow writers and people who do lots of stuff in terms of church growth kinds of work, they like to talk about it this way. That the chart represents a big generational divide between baby boomers and millennials. And so there's always some brawl that breaks out in a room about this. And part of the reason is, when you look at this chart, the two groups that are the biggest numerical groups, which is a little hidden on a chart that is drawn like this, are indeed the millennials and the baby boomers. Millennials right now, about 82 million Americans, biggest generation ever in American history. And baby boomers, the second biggest generation in American history, right now floating around 70 million members. At our height, we were 77. I was born in 1959, so I'm a boomer. At our height, we were about 77 million. Oh, that means we lost 7 million of us already, and I don't think it was due to becoming, immigrants that they left. This is what happens with generations. They get smaller as they get older. So this is the typical way that people talk about this. And I am really tired of the typical way people talk about this. And so one of the things that I've been trying to do in my work is to redirect our attention and to think about a different way of seeing that picture, the change in the lines, what that pie-shaped graph means from the University of Virginia. And so I've been asking people, what do you think this means? My friends who produced the graph with the lines, Robert Jones and Company, also produced this interesting study because they are interested in people who have left religion behind. And lots of folks in academia even were sort of hazarding guesses about this. They were saying, oh, well, maybe this is the reason, or maybe this is the reason, but they really weren't doing the research. One of the things that I actually love, here I am writing about spirituality, I actually love facts. I'm such a rebel. Facts and data gathering and all this sort of stuff teaches us things about the world. And so instead of just guessing, we ran a survey. And we asked people, we came up with the 6 reasons that we had heard people were leaving church behind. And so we gave them those 6 choices, and we asked people to pick 2 choices about if they had left their childhood religion, why was that? And we were astonished by these answers. I have to move over here so I can see the questions myself. And that is right here. The first one is you stopped believing in the religion's teachings. The second is your family was never that religious growing up. Negative teachings, this is the third, negative religious teachings about the treatment of gay and lesbian people. That's one you hear sort of talked about quite a bit. The sexual abuse scandal among clergy, mostly in Catholicism, a traumatic event in your life, or your congregation became too focused on politics. Those were all the things that scholars were saying. about why people were leaving church behind. And look at what the biggest answer was. You stopped believing the religion's teachings. I have to confess, when I saw this, I was surprised. Evidently, there has been all around us people who were actually taking things seriously that religion said. And they were evaluating whether or not those claims made any sense. Now, we don't know if all those people who answered the question that way were, say, all grew up fundamentalist churches and then left fundamentalism behind. Actually, I do know a bit about the demographics of this, and that's not the case. The people who answered that question came from huge different religious traditions. There are fundamentalists in that question. There are liberal Protestants in that question. There are Jews in that question. There are Muslims in that question. We have got, essentially, all around us, a crisis of what traditional religions are teaching, and people no longer holding on to those things, no longer believing those things. And yes, those other answers matter too, but clearly the issue of belief is primary. I actually wrote an entire book where I said that wasn't the case, and so I had to sort of eat crow when I saw the results of this study. So I'm big enough to say that when I was wrong. And so what is that belief? What is failing for people? This chart, which comes from Pew, not from Public Religion Research, I think begins to sort of point us in the direction. I think that one of the biggest problems is God. You can see the generational breakdown again in this chart, and there's all of the different 4 generations, and then this group put a tag generation, because we're having to do this now, add a group called younger millennials. So we have older millennials and younger millennials with their dates. Older millennials born from 81 to 89, younger ones from 90 to 1996. And so you see that we have 5 sets of data. The questions are, do you believe in God? Do you pray daily? And do you attend religious services at least once a week? Yeah, once a week. And isn't this interesting? Huge numbers of people. Now, I know this is regionally different, and the further west you go, the more people you run into who say they no longer are theists. So I'm well aware of that, and I hope that gets to be something we talk about in Q&A. But these are national numbers. So the younger you are, you see that belief in God does go down, but not that terribly much, especially in comparison to all of those other statistics about how people identify themselves religiously. But you see where the real gaps begin to be. Large numbers of people believe in God. Prayer, some sort of spiritual exercise by which you move outside of yourself and connect with maybe quiet or mystery or whatever, however people conceive of prayer. Prayer is kind of in the middle range, but then you look and you see people just are not going to some congregation. So I call this the God gap. Every time I talk to somebody, and I've heard other people say this as well, I know that Marcus Borg was here a couple years ago. He is such a good friend to so many of us, and me included. I miss him so much. And frequently I heard him say on the road, and he'd also say it to be in congregations, or in conversation. He would say something like, I have a lot of conversations with people about God. He said, every time somebody tells me the God that they no longer believe in, it's the same God I no longer believe in. And I said, yeah, that's the funniest thing too, because I hear that same thing. People are always saying, I don't believe in God. And I say, well, what kind of God do you believe in? They describe God, and God always looks like this. This painting is from 1515. It's an Italian painting. You can Google it. Big God, 1515 Italian painting, and this one comes right up. So it's 500 years old now. I refer to this painting as the God who haunts Western imagination. Now, not every person in this room grew up believing in this God. But this is the God that sort of hangs around. And that's that God that Marcus was always saying to people, I don't believe in that God either. I kind of love this painting. It's really beautiful. You can feel its girth, especially when it's up there like that. It suggests a lot of things about that quote that I read. A culture is influenced by the vision of God that predominates within it. So what do we have here? We have a white God. That's a little bit of trouble. And we have, obviously, a male God. So we have a racialized and genderized God. Our God is old. Here's the old white man on the throne. I have nothing against old people. My birthday's in a couple weeks. I am a lot closer to the age of this God than I am to being a college student. So I'm cool with that. But, there's a certain kind of vision that, there's wisdom here or power or whatever age represented to our ancestors. You can see the hands. This God has big hands. I know, I'm really terrible, actually. This God has very big hands. And you'll notice that God is pointing downward. And I always hope in this painting that that's not lightning bolts, but blessing. God is in heaven with the clouds. And also, one of the things that is so amazing about this picture is that, in a sense, this is Augustine's dream come true God. He has no bottom. So this is a God that, even though he is a male, has no sexual sort of stuff. And so this is it. A God who is up there, looking down on us. Like I said, I don't know that I ever really particularly believed this God. Even when I was a little girl growing up in Methodist church, God always seemed a lot closer. Methodists in particular have very warm ideas about God. But almost all of the hymns that I sang in church on Sunday were to this God. Almost all of the ideas of salvation that my church presented to me when I was growing up were about going up to heaven after I die. The prayers and the theological language was thick with verticality. And there's a reason for that. Our ancestors believed in this, that this was the actual structure of the universe. A three-tiered universe where there was heaven, where God and the angels dwelled in perfect purity. Then there was here on the earth, where we know things are messy and our lives are short, and we wonder about the purpose of this whole enterprise. And then there's that down there that nobody was ever really sure that they wanted to do because it was dank and scary, and that's where people's bodies went when they died. It's full of hummus and decay. That was the structure of the universe. It's nice to put it in the little signs like this, but here's an actual picture of medieval cosmology and how our ancestors took this three-tiered universe and developed it so intensely that heaven had all these different layers, and then you get to earth and sort of the immediate heaven and earth, and they have different layers. And then here on earth, there was a social structure and a structure of religion, a structure of politics that was also a hierarchical structure from top to bottom. And then we got to hell, that thing underneath our feet, and there was even a hierarchical structure to hell. So we took a vertically structured three-tiered universe and we multiplied it on steroids, and we created an entire vision of reality that was based on this. And the best thing, of course, was at the top. Visions of God matter. When my daughter, who I adore and has taught me so much over her lifetime, came home from school one day and said that she didn't really believe in God anymore, or she wasn't sure she did. I asked her what she didn't believe in. She said, well, I'm having a hard time. It's related to science. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, I just don't know that I can go along with what the church is teaching. And what she had really interpreted out of her experience of church and God, as I kind of got to the questions that she was asking, is that she understood church, or at least the way she was being presented it, as kind of like an elevator, where God sent things down to us. She grew up Episcopalian, so God sent us 2, sometimes 3 sacraments, depending upon the church. And so God sent things down to us, and what happened was essentially the people of God weren't allowed to touch the things that came immediately out of the elevator. So we had to have these sort of holy elevator operators right in front of the doors of the elevator who would reach in, pull things out, turn around people and say, here, take, eat, do this in remembrance of me. And then we would do that stuff, and after, if we did it nicely and well and very tastefully, is that we would go back in the elevator after we died, and someone would push the up button and we would go to heaven. And, I think she told me that sort of structured that idea out for me when she was like in 6th grade. And I was just looking at her and I thought to myself, oh my gosh, but it made sense. It made sense with the liturgy she had learned. It made sense with the vision of God that sort of was through all the hymns. It just sort of made sense with the whole structure, even the architecture of the church building. And so I began to realize that Western theology had really gotten around the problem of the vertical universe by creating religious institutions that were functionally elevators. Now, I'm in a UCC church, and so what I know is you're thinking, well, we're not that way. We're democratic. And what is really the case is, of course, different religious traditions kind of flattened the elevators through the years. It took off some of the floors, as it were. But we still really have this, because there's a Presbyterian elevator where God sends down the Word of God, which is to be well preached and in good order. And then there's the Catholic elevator with the 7 sacraments, and then there's the Lutheran elevator with the beer. There's the Pentecostal elevator that when you open the doors, whoo, fire comes out, But in all these cases, God sends us something, and that our job is to respond to it. And if we do a good job with that responding, whether it's grace alone or having to participate in the sacramental life of the church, then we get to ride the elevator up. About 100 years ago, liberal Protestants went into the elevator and we taped over the down button. We didn't get rid of the down button, though, because you had to pull the tapes off sometime when you got somebody like Hitler. And so we conveniently just kept the button there underneath the duct tape. Hitler, boom, duct tape, back. I'm tempted to take the duct tape off right now, but I'm trying really hard to be nice. But you get it, and people can laugh because we understand this whole image. And what if this is the very thing that makes no sense anymore? To my daughter. I'm in a town where people teach at universities and work in high-level science, so I really am worried about putting up the next picture. But you get it. We know the universe is not structured this way. This is a picture from the University of Cambridge's Department of Cosmology Studies. And this is what you find now when you Google in structure of the universe images. You get a picture that's like this. Rather than a three-tiered universe divided up into all of its multiplicity and complexity, you get a picture of the beginning of time there, and then how the Big Bang breaks forth, and each one of these flows of matter forming and reforming at all the different stages of creation in the history of the cosmos. If our understanding of God is related to this sort of deep structure of the universe, and our ancestors saw God up there, where is God here? That's really what my daughter wanted to talk about, and that became more obvious as she went along in school. But we don't think about a three-tiered universe or verticality when we're thinking about the nature of reality any longer. We think about things like this. So where is God? It's not an elevator. And this is, I think, what the gap in the statistics is pointing to, is that people still have some sort of rich experience of wonder, awe, mystery, the sense of otherness, the things that lie just beyond what we can even know. But they don't really have frameworks and languages to put it in. This shows up actually in data. This rather complex looking chart, which you cannot see from where you're sitting, is actually two questions. There's a top question on the top half of the chart and a bottom question on the bottom half of the chart. And these charts were produced by Pew Forum, who does a lot of study in religion. And what they realized several years ago was that you couldn't figure out what people really cared about related to religion and faith in the United States any longer simply by asking people what denomination they belong to. Yeah, it took them a while. So in 2007, Pew started trying to ask a new set of questions. And they thought to themselves, okay, well, how can you measure spirituality? And they came up with two questions. Well, it's better than none. But the two questions were, have you in the last week had a sense of spiritual peace and well-being? And then the second question was, have you in the last week experienced a sense of awe and wonder? So they asked it in 2007. And then they ask it again in 2014. That's why these little lines go up. These are comparative numbers between 2007 and 2014. And what's fascinating about these numbers is that in 2014, the last time the question was asked, almost 60% of Americans said that in the last week they had had a deep sense of spiritual peace and well-being. And just under 50% of Americans said that they had had a profound sense of awe and wonder regarding the universe in the last week. And those numbers went up in a 7-year period. They went up among people who attend, who have a sense of religious identity and the unaffiliated. And they also went up in every single generational pool in which they asked the questions. Well, this really intrigued Pew, and so they came up with another set of questions that they threw on the 2014 study. Now notice here, this is not comparative, because they didn't ask these questions in 2007. Next time they ask the survey, there will be comparison here. So they put on 2 more questions, and those questions were, have you in the last week experienced a sense of gratitude? And have you in the last week thought about meaning and purpose of your life? In 2014, an astonishing 78% of Americans said that in the last week they had had a deep sense of gratitude. And 55% of us said that we had thought about meaning and purpose in our lives. It's not just, are you a Presbyterian or are you a Reformed Jew? Are you a Buddhist or are you a Roman Catholic? Are you a member of the UCC? Are you an Episcopalian? But these 4 things right here, spiritual peace and well-being, I keep wondering to myself, what does that mean to people? Awe and wonder in the universe, a sense of gratitude, and meaning and purpose. This is how our lives are being reframed spiritually at this really interesting moment in history. We don't all share sort of conclusions about those feelings, or where those feelings take us, or what is implied by all those feelings. But when I look at those lines that are going up, they then call me into a different place of thinking about that whole question of God. What kind of vision of the sacred is predominating now? How these things, which seem to be more of a theological or spiritual currency across the old boundaries of religious traditions, that these things are conversations that we can have. These are ways to connect with one another. In Grounded, I didn't have quite all of these statistics. A lot of them came out after the book was written, but I had some of them. And so I was pointing my own sort of experience and theological imagination towards these questions, because frankly, my understanding of God had completely dissolved from where it had been in a younger part of my life to a different kind of conception that was calling toward my heart and my whole being. And I needed to figure out what really grounded me. And as I looked for God anew in my life, I began, it wasn't and I still feel this way, it's not a rejection of church, but I just got to a point with church where it was so predictable that it was making me crazy. And I hate to say that in a beautiful place like this with people, especially I know that a lot of clergy come and listen to me, and I love you. But you know what was interesting is that I started noticing my own sort of soulful gap when my friends who were clergy started telling me about how disconnected they felt from some of the things that were happening in their churches, about the theology, about the worship, about those hymns, about the liturgies, about even being able to sort of deeply speak in honest, beautiful language about the things that were on their hearts. And so I thought, well, I'm just going to go. and just follow. And so in Grounded, I explore how I began to sort of rediscover God in the world of nature. And I suppose that you'll never let me back in Colorado again once I confess this. And that was, I was the person who was terrified of nature when I was growing up. I didn't want to go camping. I talk about that a little bit in Grounded. I got kicked out of Girl Scout camp for crying too much. And and one of the Girl Scout mothers had to take me to a motel to calm me down until my mother would come and pick me up because I was terrified of sleeping outside. And so I was kind of a failure in the God and nature category. But my daughter, obviously, that was where her heart went. And when she was a teenager and we were having all these conversations, one of the things I asked her was, where do you find the most meaning? And she actually loved her youth group at her church. And this is one of the things, for those of you who are churchgoers, it's so important to kind of, a successful youth group is never hierarchical. A successful youth group always functions this way. It never functions this way. So my daughter loved this part of church, but this part was making her crazy. So I was asking her, well, where do you find God? And she said her youth group was one of those places, but the other place was when she was hiking. And that was for me the moment, the mom churchgoer moment, where I thought, I can say, well, that's really fine. You can hike all you like to find God, but as long as you are living under this roof, you are going to go to Eucharist every single Sunday. And that's what we're doing. Or I could decide to learn how to hike. And that's what I did. And so at 50 years old, I strapped on boots that I didn't know that I could wear. And we found ourselves up at Ring Lake Ranch in Du Bois, Wyoming. I don't know if there are any of my Ring Lake Ranch friends here. I can't quite see all the way out there. But a lot of them live here in this part of the world. And I've been there now 3 times, and we love it as a family. And my friends from Ring Lake Ranch, they have been so kind to me to teach me how to hike, and have put up with Diana being afraid of snakes and all kinds of stuff. And yet, I can't wait to go back. The mountains, that Wind River Range, I dream of it. And now, my husband and I had to get away from Washington this week. And we went down to the Blue Ridge. And we found ourselves walking in the foothills through a meadow on a farm that went back to the 1700s. We walked through the meadow, and then we're in the woods, and then up in the foothills in the Blue Ridge, and these lovely ancient mountains, so old that the tops of them are worn all away. And there was God. In nature. And that's good. You know that. That's your place. And that is actually Ring Lake Ranch right there. The other place, and this was my place, is that I'm an extrovert, so I always found God with people. And church, and the things that I'd written about earlier in my career, finding God with all of us, with our neighbors. And so Grounded moves through these 2 places of finding God in nature, my daughter's picture, and then she also finds God with her neighbor. And this was a picture that she sent me as well from orientation week at UVA. And gosh, I don't know how it works here at Boulder with the university, but the very first thing they do is they get these kids in these service groups, and they go out and they cover Charlottesville, and they do volunteer service projects. The largest single student organization at the University of Virginia is the volunteer organization. And millennials might not necessarily be in buildings to find God, but they are at farms and in streets and preschools and social justice marches, and they are amazing. My daughter's friends are amazing. And what all this takes us to, and here we are almost to our question part. is that we're not very good right now about drawing pictures of God. We don't know how to paint kind of a new reality. Because the vertical has given way towards this. And what nature and neighbor and finding God in those places teaches us is that, as the Pope wrote in his beautiful encyclical, is that we live in a single spiritual ecology of community and creation, of nature and neighbor, of environment and economics. And that everything is connected. The vision of God that is emerging is that God is not above all of this, beyond it, outside of it, but instead that the very presence of the being of God, the mystery that we have called God, is woven itself into the fabric of the universe. And God is not just some far-off weaver of webs who left us here to be entangled all by ourselves, but that God is here in the web with us. It's quite different. Another one of the great paintings of Western art, of course, is this one from the Vatican, where the Pope, who wrote so eloquently of connectedness in his chapel, this picture speaks volumes about Western visions of God. And I always think that this little space right there is the most important part of the picture. Because God and Adam don't touch. And right there is 2,000 years of Christian theology. Can that gap ever be bridged? What bridges it? How irreconcilable is it? Why is human nature unable to reach fully to the divine? Is the divine too pure to ever be able to even touch our fingertips? The amount of intellectual energy that has been spent on that problem over the last 2,000 years is enormous throughout Christianity. And I think that it's just time to get rid of that picture. When I went out to find what grounded me, I found this. I was talking to a friend of mine, a fellow by the name of Phil Clayton. I don't know if any of you who are theology geeks might recognize Phil's name. Phil is a professor at Claremont School of Theology in Southern California now. And he is one of the leading process theologians in the world, the new generation of process theologians. The reason I talked to Phil is I've known him since we were 18 years old. We went to the same small evangelical Christian college in Santa Barbara, California. And I was telling him about the book I was writing and about this, Finding God This Way. And he looked at me and he said, "Diana, you're a panentheist." I never knew. And I said, well, part of that is because I kept it a secret. And he said, Well, you did a good job of that. Keeping it a secret, that is. And I said, well, for the first part of my writing life, I was writing to churches, and I was thinking about how we make better community. And the point wasn't really what I thought about God. And so I always sort of moved my understandings of the presence of God and my understandings of theology a bit more to the background in order to move congregations and how we make community more to the foreground. I said, but you know what? You might not think I've always been a panentheist, but I have been. And I told Phil about how after we were no longer students at Westmont in Santa Barbara, he went on and went to Fuller Seminary, and I went to another seminary called Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, another evangelical seminary on the East Coast of the United States. And I said I was sitting in this class taught by a fellow by the name of Richard Lovelace, who was a Presbyterian minister, and it was a class on Jonathan Edwards. We read almost everything Edwards wrote in that class. By the way, if you ever are looking for a progressive Episcopal woman who knows everything that can be known about Jonathan Edwards, I'm the only one right here. And I've always loved Jonathan Edwards. But so Lovelace was talking about Edwards, and we were reading early Edwards, which was all of his stuff about nature. And there are beautiful, lyrical, amazing parts of Jonathan Edwards where he's walking through fields outside of New Haven, where he's looking at spiders. He was obsessed with spiders, and in good ways, not just bad ways. For those of you who know some of his Sinners in the Hands of the Angry God and the spider hanging over the fire, Edwards just loved spiders. He thought they were amazing. Birds, all this stuff. Edwards was a nature mystic. And so here was Lovelace, and he was talking about this in this room full of evangelical young adults who mostly were all Jesus movement people from the 70s, and now it was the early 1980s. And Professor Lovelace looks up from this sort of just poetic lecture and says, there are some people who think that Jonathan Edwards was a panentheist. And then he went on with his lecture. And he was kind of quirky. He didn't notice that there was an entire room full of young evangelicals. Professor Lovelace, what's a panentheist? And so finally he realized that something weird was happening in the room. And he looks up and he goes, we said, we don't know what that word means. And he said, oh. He said, well, theism is the belief that there is us and there is God. And then pantheism is the belief that there is us and God. And so in theism, there is God and the tree. In pantheism, there is God and the tree. And God and the tree are the same. And he said, but then there's panentheism. Everyone in the room was just like, well, what's he going to say? He said, in panentheism is that God is with the tree, and the tree is with God. Not the same, but interdependent and interpenetrating of one another. And I went, whoa, that's what I am. I was 23. And it took a long time for me to understand why that was radical. But tonight, it makes all the difference in the world. Because if you're in the framework where God is there and we are here and there is a gap, well, there are some interesting problems that you have set up for yourself and for society. Western culture a long time ago was pantheist, and a lot of people are returning to that view, and God bless them. That is a way of structuring realities that make sense in so many ways. I have friends who are Wiccans. I have friends who just kind of do their own kind of construction of spirituality, and that's really what is their view. I spoke at the World Parliament of Religions a little bit more than a year ago, and I was really impressed with the people who had adopted that as theirs. But that's not me. That this is where I am. And this is where I think that the Christian story was actually always intended to be. And here I stand with friends like Marcus Borg or like Richard Rohr, who are recovering and who are making the case that having a God who is with and in and through everything is not only theologically and biblically sound, but it is a social and spiritual revolution of the first rank that can help us move beyond the problems of division and hierarchy and control and power that we have been stuck with in Western culture for too long. And so here and here. Yeah. And that's when I want to have you all ask me some questions.